Okay, well, hello and welcome everybody. Good morning. Welcome to the second installation of our Alea Iacta series on the intersections of ancient history and the world of video games, where we have scholars from both fields of inquiry and also combined fields of inquiry together to discuss major topics in all this. So today we're going to be welcoming two speakers, Dr. Ross Clare, who's a research fellow at the University of Liverpool, and Dr. Roger Travis, who's an associate professor of classics at the University of Connecticut, for talks about 20 minutes each on aspects of narrative history in the ancient world in video games. My name is Mick Larson. I'm the David Hood Professor of Ancient History here at California State University, Long Beach, and I'm joined by my fellows from the Center for Critical Play here, Dr. Jeff Lawler and Dr. Sean Smith, who run a tremendous archive of knowledge and also of media, as you can see behind me, and also in fake form behind Dr. Lawler here in our wonderful archive. So we'll have questions after the presentation, so please save them. You're free to talk in chat with one another as long as one remains respectful. You've all been on the internet before. With that sort of taken care of in terms of like what our program is, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Lawler to start our formal introductions.
Okay, welcome everybody. We're really excited to present this next installation. And I'll introduce first Dr. Ross Clare, who, as mentioned, is a teacher at the University of Liverpool, UK. Research centers around popular reception of Greece and Rome and popular culture, including video games, television, and science fiction. He recently published in 2021, Ancient Greece and Rome in Video Games, Representation, Play, Transmedia with Bloomsbury Press. And he's currently working on a soon-to-be-published book that looks at ancient Roman Greece and science fiction called Amazing Antiquity. There's an exclamation point there. Greece and Rome and modern science fiction. In particular, Ross is interested in popular culture's position in historical games to better understand the fluid complexities of antiquity as it changes shape in each video game text. Welcome, Dr. Ross Clare. Our second speaker for today is Dr. Roger Travis. He's Associate Professor of Classics at the University of Connecticut, where he's director of the Video Games and Human Values Initiative. It's an online nexus for scholarly activities. He's also a founder of Play the Past blog, which you should take a look at, which explores the intersection of cultural heritage and games, meaningful play. It is published broadly and recently published an article entitled The Bethesda Style, the Open World Role-Playing Games as Formulaic Epic, in the book Classical Antiquity in Video Games. Roger's work examines these formulaic epics and the fundamental connection between ancient epic and narrative in video games. Welcome, Dr. Travis. We don't have any order here, so we're going to go in alphabetical order by last name. So that means, Ross, you have won the prize.
Hey, it's very nice. It's good to be here. I got to meet a bunch of new faces. I don't mean to start with a disclaimer or anything, but it's been, I have been working on science fiction, but it's been about a year since I was actually in a university. I've been working in a game studio for a few months now, including on a very small mobile strategy game about Sparta, which is kind of cool. I'm going to try and draw on that while we're here because I'm lucky enough to have been involved in some of the creative process there, which is kind of cool. But this is mostly about, I suppose, what I've been doing and what I would like to do if I ever get the chance to do more. So I wrote this on the left. It spilled out of my PhD thesis. It was originally going to be a genre study, which it kind of is. Split up into chapters between kind of action, adventure, strategies, point and clicks, and that kind of thing. But it struck me more the more research I did that there was a kind of direction that the study of history and games was taking. And I wasn't entirely sure if I agree with it, which is fair. The current thing right now. As you see there, it seems to be about seeing historical games or history in games as history. Now, there would be different forms of history apart from kind of what we're doing in the classroom. Nonetheless, it's still the idea to see it as some form of history. My thinking is that the creative processes that go into making games and the kind of processes that go into playing them are distinctly not historical. That's my belief anyway. I'm going to try and explain how I got there, but it's it seems to be Spring's idea that with a game, the historian can engage research questions, incorporate primary, secondary source evidence, explore historical themes, present a thesis, and make historical arguments, which you can do with game technologies. You absolutely can do that. But do you actually, like, as an honest question, is that actually what you do when you're playing historical games? Issues probably less academic than ideological, because I wonder if we're at risk of drawing the study of games into this kind of comfortable sphere of historical study, rather than kind of going out there, trying to understand what games are and what they're doing. In the book, I tried to pair off Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which I imagine many of you will know, against its kind of companion discovery tour. So Assassin's Creed Odyssey is a meticulously recreated 5th century Greek world that you're wandering about. It's a very real feeling ancient landscape, fighting, collecting items, interacting with people. Whereas I feel like something like the Discovery Tour effectively strips to provide you with what's essentially an educational experience. And it seems to me to be very fundamental differences between one game and the other in terms of how it's been made, why it's been made, and how we actually play it. So my thinking is that anything educational is probably fundamentally different to something that is played as a video game. It is a bit simplistic, I know, but I feel that one requires the player to engage with places, spaces, and artifacts to learn. That's the discovery tour, but the other one requires you to engage in a very different way to combat, interact with a narrative or a series of narratives. So we try a slightly less clear-cut example. Again, I wonder if many of you probably played Apotheon, probably pronouncing that wrong. But again, many of you might know, but many of you might not. It's a kind of action-oriented platformer in which players move left to right, right to left, up and down across a 2D plane. You fight enemy soldiers with this little fella in the middle. And there are monsters and ultimately the Olympian gods themselves that you have to kind of battle against. It's pretty striking to anybody, player or no. It has this kind of incredible visual style. It's based on classical art to some kind of wide degree. So it gives the impression of vase painting come to life. What's more, it's full of references to the classical world. It's got explicit passages to Homeric hymns within it. And I guess you might say that players enact certain kind of ancient concepts as a hero, though I reckon your man Roger would do a lot better at explaining that than me. Nonetheless, it might very easily be claimed this is almost like delving into history and playing it. But I wonder if it is, no matter how much it looks and how much it feels like an ancient world, is it? I wonder if it will be, well, once we jump in and we find out where all these passages are from and where the influences have come from, how creators have gone from text and artifact and material culture into creating a game, we might see what's happening further beyond that. It might be more revealing. Try to understand what happens when a player plays without necessarily knowing anything about ancient Greece. What players' minds are actually doing. What these kind of modern people are conceiving of, seeing, and therefore acting. And I keep talking about like cognitive processes, which sounds a lot smarter than it is. My understanding of cognitive science is quite limited. and that's being generous. But when it came to trying to understand the nature of gameplay, I came across some pretty interesting results about inferences, you see here in bold, making inferences and implicit information. So when you're playing a game, it's not necessarily that you're paying attention to everything in any kind of conscious fashion. Rather, it's that when you're playing a game, you become immersed and you will just kind of be. This is how you play a game, and then you look up and it's 4 in the morning. That's what happens, is you're not conscious of time passing. You're not necessarily conscious of everything that you're doing. There's also a suggestion beyond this literature right here, that there's a certain degree of knowledge that comes to the fore when you're playing a game as well. That you have to, again, not necessarily consciously, but you have to draw on some kind of knowledge to enact something in the game that you need to do or that you mean to do. And that's kind of the crux of me. I believe that what you're drawing on there is very important, this kind of informal knowledge that Raphael Samuel suggests here. I think you're drawing on something that's, yeah, it's informal. It's not necessarily even known. It's more like an impression. You're drawing on these sort of phantoms of the ancient world to engage with popularly conceived images, if that makes any sense. So that it is separate from processes that we undertake when we're trying to actually figure out what happened. It's the difference between the pursuit of fact and engagement with imagination. And I'm not the only one to kind of think about this in terms of informal knowledges. Obviously, Raphael Samuel is down there, but the fantasy writer and all-round legend Terry Pratchett identified much the same thing in a paper for the Folklore Journal. He talks about mythology in particular as being something you never really learn about. Rather, it's just images that appear as you're growing up. So if you apply that to antiquity, it's simply something that people don't necessarily get formal training in. You don't even necessarily learn it at school. It just is. There isn't any apparent source. It just happens at you, often in the form of games. And that, I think, that is a thing within itself. That is a form of the ancient world in and of itself that helps to perpetuate popular culture and is perpetuated by it. That I feel is different. I feel is something else. That is, if you're latching onto something in the game or latching onto something in your mind to play the game, it's going to have to be something that's familiar to you, but not, it's going to have to be, it's probably going to be implicit. It's probably going to be inferred by you. And you see there, Adam Chapman, who I actually thought I'd pull up there and haven't, like a fool, but he's written a fantastic book on history of games. And he's pioneering this idea of the player of a game as a historian. However, he also signals the importance of what we could term common knowledge. He talks about this a lot. He also references Raphael Samuel as well. And this is the idea of history, or a form of history existing as like a vague conception, I suppose. And that's exactly what I'm trying to kind of mine into. Kind of a simplified example, you don't necessarily need to read Herodotus, a game about the Persian Wars. You just have to have something kicking off up there. So you're faced with this game. I won't even tell you what it is, but if you were landed right here in the position of the player, you'd identify Greekness in some way or another. It wouldn't necessarily be, I know what those pillars are, or I know what this guy is, or I know where this landscape is supposed to be. For most people, they're going to reach Greekness through kind of vaguely recognizable reference and signifiers, so classical columns, those weirdly recognizable aesthetic patterns that you see, the little kind of square-like things. And then, of course, if you're completely new to ancient Greece and you don't know what any of this looks like, or more generic things like sword and armor, beards and robes, genre knowledges, perhaps arcade or whatever. So the idea is that informal knowledge is actually kind of central, probably to the creative process of making a game, but certainly to actually playing them. And it's Volkerts who gives us a run through Fable, which is, I think, behind Jeff. We've got like 5 copies of it. In that image. It's the first thing I saw. But Volkerts gives us kind of these signifiers that hit us, and some of them have to do with sort of the general fantasy setting, and some of them don't. So the game opens, it's got this big Hollywood music, and then it shows you visuals of an armored warrior, which kind of places you into this thing, this fantasy realm of thinking. It's probably the best way to put. It's putting you in the right place, what to expect, what you're going to be doing next. And it does that further by granting you access to the settings. And Volkerts calls this triggering associations with mental images, like a shadow image, or a phantom image of a history, as opposed to actual history. So my thinking then is that we might lean away. Sorry, I know this is all very fast. The idea, I suppose, is to lean away from thinking about classical games as forms of history. And you might think, of course not, who would, but it does seem to be, it's very tempting for us, I think, to take the game, right? You sit in the middle, you take the video game, and then you go left towards classical sources. You want to see where it came from. You want to go towards what you know, because you're a classicist or an ancient historian. This bit of this game reminds me of that bit of literature, or this activity reminds me of that classical concept. And then we'll write in our conclusions, this can tell us a lot about classics in the modern digital world, and end it there. I should know, I've done that, I did that too, I do that all the time. But I am interested in seeing how far we can go, like if we can go even further into this kind of wider, weird continuum of popular culture, and kind of leap outwards. And I think if you do that, you might be able to see just how far antiquity's influence extends, because it will necessarily become less easy to spot. But it will also show just how many kind of tendrils it's got out there. I probably going to keep referring to the book, but within that book, I undertook a pretty extensive analysis of this tiny little indie game called Eleusis. And it's a first-person puzzler in which we take control of a man stranded in a village. So we're just, in his first-person perspective, wandering about in a village that's strongly implied to be either in or around the modern-day Eleusis area. We're drawn into a plot by cultists to resurrect Typhon. No idea why. It's our job to either help destroy the modern world or to take down the cult. There's no combat in this thing. It's literally as you see here. It is a little hand as an icon, and you're looking as if through the man's head, locating items, using them in certain places, unlocking areas, and that sort of thing. The only real threat is the occasional cultist who you have to hide from, or a wolf that pops up here and there, but you have to run away from it, of course, because you're just a bloke. Anyway, the more I was playing Eleusis, the more I kind of started to see all these different, well, this whole kind of complex network of receptions surrounding ancient Eleusis. So I could see, obviously, people have been drawing on Eleusis for like thousands of years, right? To do all sorts of things, for their own ceremonies, or for their own beliefs, or for art and literature and that kind of thing. And as I was playing this game, I started to see like these shadows of like the 60s and 70s reflections on Eleusis by feminists and kind of environmentalists is the word I'm trying to get to. And I'm playing this game and I see a reverence of nature and of mountains and things that seem to extend back to ancient Greek thought. This kind of complex tension between urbanism and natural environment. These are all things I'm seeing in Eleusis as I'm playing it. When I finish and I step back, and if I'm absolutely honest, I don't believe any of that directly influenced the creation of the game. And I don't believe any player of Eleusis is necessarily drawing on that complex strand of reception. Definitely exists, and it's absolutely worth finding. But that's going one way, and we go the other way to make a full picture of what's really happening and what we're supposed to be doing in here. surely a player, whoever, whatever training they've got, is involving themselves in knowledges that are more informal, more common, and less esoteric and niche. So I wonder then, if this game is filled with like black cottage, not necessarily seeing anything Greek so much as something generically scary, something you've seen perhaps films like The Wicker Man, The Witch, that kind of thing. You actually concoct a cacaon, again, probably not pronouncing that one right. The potion taken at the ancient Eleusis ritual, and you do that not necessarily because you're supposed to do that at Eleusis, but because they recognized that was needed to progress in the game. I think it was Buxton who was talking about wolves in the ancient world, and he talks about the kind of psychological tension when it comes to ancient Greeks. A wolf represents the kind of dividing line between a lived-in space and outside world. But in reality, really, we're running in the game from a wolf because it's a wolf. Right? It's players doing what seems right, I suppose. And again, I really don't mean to suggest we're leaving classics behind in any sense. We're not to forget the roots of Eleusis. We're definitely not to forget the kind of post-classical reception that spills out of Eleusis and finds its way kind of wriggling through a game like this. But right now, I guess I feel it's important to fill in the blanks, to look at the gray areas, to kind of fill in that stuff that's around the classical stuff, to kind of see how it all fits together. And of course, that doesn't mean that the ancient world gets lost, as I kind of mentioned. It just means that when you're playing a game like Eleusis and you're kind of drawing ever further away from its ancient roots, you're actually kind of dragging Eleusis along with you as you're creating this stuff and you're playing this stuff. You're dragging this whole network of reception further and further out. It's getting harder to see, but it's still out there, and it's still changing things. It's still getting changed by stuff. And yeah, I thought I might mention that I actually got to have a talk with one of the higher up creatives in the company I'm currently working for, about how they came up with the War Empires, very small mobile strategy game. And they were tasked with adding new Italian units, just Italians, someone from Italy, like Romans and stuff. And they were like, well, you can't do that because it's set in, this game set in 5th century BC during the Persian Wars. And they said, well, you're gonna have to do it anyway. And so they tried to figure out what they could do. Maybe they could throw in some tribal Italians and stuff. But the solution they ultimately came to is just use actual Roman Imperial units. And the whole upshot of that really is that, yeah, you could make some kind of tenuous suggestions that this or that may have existed not that far before or after this or that. But at the end of the day, for creators and players, it worked because it felt right. Well, there's a lot of information there all at once. You got to remember that I'm in the UK, so I'm at the end of my working day and I'm tired. But a very brief recap, I guess. You probably don't need it, but let's give it a go anyway. There seem to be these two opposing ways to look at how classics and games works, but actually I think they're entirely complementary. There's an element of kind of finding out the roots of the games, which is you absolutely have to do. Like, I want to see that there are echoes of Euripides and God of War. But then there's this other thing, this other kind of trying to figure out how people really kind of get into it, how creators make it, and how players play it, and kind of what that means, where it goes after that, where it really exists in this kind of broad, bigger picture sort of sense. And that kind of leans towards this idea of Greece and Rome almost existing, I suppose, as something very different, something imagined. But it is mobile, it is active, it's always been screened, it's always been changed and written and thought about. The problem, of course, is that we have like centuries of scholarship and thought about what history is. So we can quite easily take historical frameworks and fit games into them. But what's the other thing, right? How do you, if you want to think about kind of popular antiquity, I like to call it, like popular antiquity, popular classics, that continuum that we kind of know and that we kind of draw on when we're engaging with pop culture. What is that? What is that, and how do you visualize it? And I think for me, the key is to fit popular antiquity into the framework of world building. So you take this widely understood notion of the ancient world, there's a lot of that today, the ancient world, and actually conceive of it as a fictional world, just as you would anything, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, whatever. And that's what world building is, really. At its most basic definition, world building is the creation by an individual or a group of individuals of a make-believe space. It could be a world like our own or a fantasy style continent, whatever. A lot of times these days, built worlds or world-built worlds are deliberate or that, but not always. Sometimes they just are. Sometimes they're. Can you hear me? Oh yeah, sorry, I just froze. Sometimes these worlds just exist. They just do. And the great thing about worlds is that they're never static, like they never just are, and that they're never isolated, which I think is essential. Like, when you think about a fictional world, you'll know that it's drawing from lots of different things, and that it's influencing lots of different things, and it's being changed by lots of stuff, and changing lots of other stuff, etc. So I wonder about seeing, the ancient world as the ancient world. There it is. That's what it is there, right there. It's like a spherical symbol representing the ancient world as it exists out there in popular culture. Now you just imagine in your mind, because I'm not very good at visual design at all, imagine that it's absolutely stuffed full of all the units or constituents you'd expect. It's got the Iliad in there, Julius Caesar, centurions, marble columns, and everything that exists as reported in ancient source material. And that now exists because that's what we know, what we feel we know about the ancient world. And everything that's kind of imagined about the ancient world is kind of stuffed in this constantly moving universe, right? And it's not entirely outlandish either. I remember reading Nick Lowe talking about the Odyssey, and he talks about the Odyssey having its own story universe. So he's talking about the Odyssey narrative as having its own world, and he's right. You think about it, we all read the same text, right? But we're all building it in our minds in our own way. We all draw on our own preconceptions, our own belief as to what the Odyssey story looks like. And again, I know there are plenty of students here. You imagine being in the class, and your professor's like, remember line B where X did Y? And you all think, yeah, of course I do. But actually, in one way or another, you're all thinking different things. You're all imagining different things. So I suggest that we might collect those imaginations up. We collect up these post-classical materials and add them into a story universe, like one big ancient world. Your understanding of the Odyssey and mine. You know what I mean? Mine's developed from some documentary I saw, but yours has come from some film or other. At the end of the day, the Odyssey is imagined by all of us anyway. And you might as well say the same about pretty much any text. Breathe. Now, as I said before, the fictional world it's never static, and it's never isolated. So worlds will ping off other worlds. You take, for example, bear with me. Take, for example, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Right? I swear, this should work. And you consider it to be a world, right? But the whole Frankenstein world, it's got everything in it. Again, it's got the book and all the other stuff, all the many films, right? We know that Frankenstein, like the book, it's got roots or echoes of the myth of Prometheus. But we also know that it takes inspiration from varying ghost stories, Shelley's best mate, Lord Byron, Bram Stoker's Dracula, and all of that. So the Frankenstein world is now connected to all these other worlds, the Lord Byron world, for want of a better name. And of course, the ancient world, which will probably actually connect to all the others as well. But for now, we can see that the Frankenstein world is connected to all these other things that have influenced it, right? And you have to realize that, veer away from antiquity for a second to suggest a point, that to engage with something Frankensteinian, right? This space is all the imagined dimensions of what Frankenstein means: books, sequels, pseudo-sequels, films, whatever, comic books. You don't have to be aware of Shelley's original story to enjoy, say, the 1994 film in which De Niro is Frankenstein's monster. It follows then that it engages with any form of Frankenstein, let's say a brand new film or video game or whatever that pops up. You don't need to catch hold of the profoundly Promethean dimension of the story to actually engage with it and enjoy it, right? You do need to do something though. You need to put some kind of cognitive effort in. And I suppose one benefit of encapsulating these things is like antiquity and Frankenstein and everything all into these kind of discrete worlds that nonetheless bump up against each other. You get to see them in action, right? The ancientness, once you kind of map out in this very, very, very rudimentary way, you see the ancientness has these kind of like tentacles like stretching out and touching everything. And that they will remain pivotal for as long as we remember that they're there, right? But still, you require only a kind of informal conception of generic knowledges to kind of really engage with any of it, I suppose. Now, I'm gonna risk another example before I run out of time, right? Or
Okay.
if you want me to shut up, just let me know.
No, we don't, but we're at just over 30 minutes. So if you just want to give a quick kind of wrap up, that would be great. Thank you.
Problem. All right, Greek world, same as the ancient world. It's Greek, it's got less Roman stuff in it. Connected to the Roman world very intimately, of course, because there's plenty of influence kind of crossover there. The Greek world is quite close to the world of Tolkien, right? Well, we just had a volume on that, which I'm in as well, by the way. And it's got plenty of kind of Greekness in it, but your appreciation of the Greekness in Tolkien isn't contingent on your actual knowledge of Greek texts, right? And then you get further and further away, way off up there, the world of Red Dead Redemption, which you can ask me about later, appears to have these kind of references to the classical world in them. It's very, very far away because the connection is quite tenuous, but at the same time, you can still visualize it, you can still see what it is and what these kind of this map can do for you, I suppose. And there was a whole thing on Mass Effect, but I think I'm probably going to leave that. Even though it's great. If you haven't played Mass Effect yet, it's brilliant. Right? But I suppose the big question really is why bother with a new approach? Why kind of try and convolute it? I've found that a focus on worlds, especially doing that kind of science fiction work, has been really helpful. Although I've probably done nothing but complicate it here. There's a game chapter in the upcoming book on science fiction, and especially these later open world exploratory game experiences. Seeing it as a world impinging on other worlds it will really help you to get a sense of not just how classical antiquity goes from here into the game, but what it does within it and how it kind of messes around with other stuff. And yeah, that's essentially it. That's the purpose of doing it, I suppose. You might have this kind of pleasant benefit of taking it away from formal historical practice that we know. But you also kind of get to see what's happening out there in this really complex world of popular culture. Yeah, I think we'll leave it there. That's there. I think I'm done.
All right, thank you, Ross. That was great. We talked earlier, and some of your work kind of rhymes with what I'm doing. But we're gonna move on. We'll have some Q&A afterwards, and we'll move on to Dr. Roger Travis, and we'll let you do your own screen share.
All right. Thank you very much for this invitation. This is really fun, especially to get to share a bill with Ross. I mean, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so I see all kinds of intersection between what I want to talk about and what Ross just talked about. Maybe, so in the Q&A, we can see whether we can make those connections. But there's one thing I wanted to kind of highlight at the beginning, and it has a lot to do with how I'm connecting this talk, which is kind of about what I do and kind of about how we all might want to apply it to Elden Ring, or how you can help me apply it to Elden Ring, because it's something I want to do. How am I going to connect that to narrative and ancient history in video games? Because I'm definitely not a historian. I'm a literary scholar. And that literary scholarship, as you'll see in the course of this talk, has brought me to talking, especially and doing research into games. These days, I'm actually mostly focused on living card games, as put out by the game company Fantasy Flight Games. And if you're very sharp-eyed, you can maybe spot one of those games on one of the bookshelves behind me. In any case, my take on ancient history in relation to video games is to turn it on its head in a certain sense. And I look at how modern video game narratives parallel and actually renew one of the most important ways, as I see it. And in some sense, it's the very most important way that archaic and classical Greeks did their own history. That is the way they thought about their past. And for a big stretch of time, and then continuing on through even the time when the Athenian culture and the rest of Greek culture was becoming literate, the Homeric epic, which we think of as these texts, and Ross, in fact, was just talking about the text of the Odyssey, and I had to bite my tongue, keep my sound muted, because for the Athenians, even as the text of Homer, we think, because we don't know anywhere near as much about this as we would like to know, even as the text of Homer is getting produced, those epics are still in something like their original oral formulaic forms. And that is that what we have in those texts from which we can talk about line numbers, those are fossils. They're fossils of what was once a living epic tradition in which bards passed down their individual versions of the stories from generation to generation. And so that is the way they did history. And when what we think of as history, and I think Ross and we probably would disagree in very interesting ways about a lot of stuff. But when I think what Ross would agree, we tend to think of today as history starts with Herodotus, who I would say, and most people would agree with me, is not really a historian. And then with Thucydides, who is, from most accounts, the first historian. When they look back and talk about, meditate on even, what it was that their contemporaries thought of as the study of the past, the place that they looked was Homer. And we think of him as a guy, Homer, but while it's not completely out of the question to say that there was a guy named Homer, he was not a blind poet who came up with, let alone wrote down, the Iliad and the Odyssey. He was probably a name for a tradition, and I buy the theorists who say that his name is actually a back formation on the name for somebody who did what the bards did. And it seems like his name might even mean the guy who puts the song together. So that it seems like it was a title for a bard, or maybe a special subset of bards. And by bard, I just mean a singer of tales. That is a storyteller who sang along with their lyre, L-Y-R-E. That is more or less a guitar, and knew how to do it professionally and how to reconstruct what we think of now as the Iliad and the Odyssey on the fly. And I'll talk a little more about the research that helps us here. But I wanted to set that up as what the connection between this presentation might be and the title of Alea Iacta to Narrative and Ancient History in Video Games. Okay, so it seems always to make most sense to kind of talk about this stuff in the context of how I got there. And it was actually not in 2001 with Halo. I was out of gaming in 2001, doing a graduate degree in comparative literature. But by the time 2004 rolled around with Halo 2, I had just gotten tenure, and my birthday was coming up, and I bought myself the present of an Xbox and played the heck out of Halo 2, and realized that my immersion in it, and Ross was talking a lot about immersion. Immersion is going to be really important for what I'm going to try to express here. My immersion in it had something, well, mythic about it. So I wrote a piece for a kind of popular online journal called The Escapist about Halo and the Aeneid, because I saw a direct parallel between well, in 2001, it was September 2001, in fact, and Halo saved Microsoft's bacon by coming out and presenting a mythic picture of a super soldier saving the universe from a bunch of religiously motivated aliens. And that connection said to me, okay, these games, although they seem to be about the far future, and this is my point about mythology when I teach mythology anyway, these games are about us. And that was the main point I was making when I compared it to the Aeneid, which is about a super soldier who is equally as devoid of emotion as Master Chief is, and is equally a reflection for an ideal Roman, as Master Chief is, from at least one perspective, a reflection. You can see it in his helmet, a reflection for us, even if he's a lot more warlike than most of us would ideally think we should be. In September 2001, even I mean, I don't know if I should feel ashamed to admit this, but I do. Even I was feeling very warlike, and I am not a warlike person. So I saw the connection, and then it occurred to me that there was something else that had to be going on. And I realized that there was, in fact, a deeper connection between the epic tradition and games like Halo. Oh, and this is maybe the time to insert a little bit about my title, the phrase adventure video game. That's really just supposed to be a catch-all title for any video game that lets you, the player, perform a story of adventure. So it covers a huge range of different games. You might, I mean, one could argue that in a certain sense it covers all games, because anytime you play, even if you're playing Papers, Please, you have an adventure. In the other direction, though, I think it's important to say, okay, we're mostly talking about games like Halo, and then the games that I came quickly to focus on, which are digital RPGs. And I'll talk in a little detail about the ones I took on in just a moment. But the thing that I came to connect it with very quickly, and this is partly because of who I worked with as an undergrad, who I worked with as a graduate student, who were very interested in the Homeric tradition and its, well, what's come to be known as its multiformity, or multiformness. That is the way that in the days before it became these fossils, the Iliad and the Odyssey, it would change on a nightly basis. Now, opinions differ widely as to how much it would change, but we do have this precious witness in the Odyssey itself of these two bards. They're called oidoi. That just means singers. They're singers of tales. One of them is a more realistic portrait of a guy named Phemius, who's the bard on Odysseus's home island of Ithaca. And he's interesting in and of himself because the suitors, you know, the guys who are trying to marry Odysseus's wife and are in the process of eating up his household. And literally that's what the bard says over and over. They're eating up his household. And he has to kind of conform his stories to what the suitors want. And so he's constantly, that's Phemius, who's not the bard pictured here. Phemius is constantly telling stories about how the heroes had a really, really hard time coming home. And it makes Penelope cry, and she tries to get him not to sing it. But the more interesting bard, because we have more of him, is Demodocus. Now, Demodocus lives on what's basically a fantasy island, not the fantasy island, although, I mean, you never know. But in any case, Demodocus lives on the island of Scyria in Apolis, a city-state called Phaeacia, which is where Odysseus fetches up at the end of his adventures. Now, you can never know how many people have read the Odyssey or how many people remember it, but the part that everybody thinks of as the Odyssey, that is the adventures, that happens in the middle in a flashback. And the reason I'm drilling down on that is that this moment that you see in this fake vase painting, this moment between Odysseus, who's on the right covering his face in his cloak, and Demodocus on the left, who's got his lyre, is what introduces those adventures, which are sometimes called the apologue, which just means a tale out of, a tale away from, because it takes us away from the main narrative of the Odyssey, which is about Odysseus finding his homecoming. In any case, we've known since the 1930s that the Homeric epics were not originally written down, that they must originally have been made up on the fly, sung by singers of tales, like this Yugoslavian Guzlar, who you see on the cover of Albert Lord's Singer of Tales. They must have been recomposed by illiterate bards on a nightly basis. And every time that bard sang that song, let's say it's the song of how Demodocus sang to Odysseus in the house of Eleusis, that's the king of Phaeacia, say it's that song, every night that song is inevitably going to be different. The bard cannot sing it exactly the same way twice, any more than a gamer playing Halo or KOTOR, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, or Skyrim, or Elden Ring, any more than they can play, no matter how virtuosic they are, the same level the same way twice, or the same boss fight the same way twice, the same part of the adventure the same way twice. There is an essential multiformity, a recompositional element of recompositional performance in the Odyssey and the Iliad, which is the same as that recomposition and performance that happens in adventure video games. And this actually, I thought of it before I read Hamlet on the holodeck, but then I found, partly to my sorrow and partly to my joy, that Janet Murray had pointed out exactly the same thing about Lord's theories. And I should also say, Lord was the student of a famous, not as famous as Lord because he died so young, although there was recently a book written about Milman Parry, who was the teacher. He died young, and Lord carried on his work. Parry, fascinatingly enough, figured out the oral element of the epics without the comparative evidence of the Yugoslavian Guzlars. Parry figured it out just from looking at the formulas. And if you want me to do a deep dive on the formulas, I'm happy to do it. But they are the elements of, call them elements of content, the way you might in a video game. And they get recomposed into the epics as we know them.
Roger, I'm gonna. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
Sure.
I think we're having some issues with some of the images that you were trying to show.
Okay. Well, you know, I'll escape out of it and just talk.
Okay, that's fine. And your camera has been off as well, so.
Really? Oh,
yes,
darn it.
That's okay.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know how to manage that. Sorry about that.
No worries.
In any case, I lost thread. Oh, thread is a good place to start it up, because if I had my slides, I would show you a passage from the Odyssey in which Odysseus talks to Demodocus at the end of book 8 of the Odyssey, and praises him greatly. and says that the Muses gave to Demodocus and other singers like him this thing. The Greek word is oime, which seems to mean path. And it's usually translated as song because in the very few instances we have of this word, it clearly does mean song. But remember that we're talking about illiterate bards. What we think of as a song, even if we're listening on the radio, watching a YouTube video, it's got a set of lyrics, and that set of lyrics is not going to change. Demodocus and the bards on whom he was based couldn't do that. When they had an oime, it was like a level of a video game. They knew kind of what was going to happen. It could happen in a different order. It could happen in one of Lord's best examples. One time a hero rides a horse, another time a hero doesn't ride a horse. The example from the Yugoslavian Guzlars. And the same is true in Elden Ring. You can ride your horse or you don't have to ride your horse. And either way, the basic oime, the path of the song, the path of the story is going to be the same. But your experience could be radically different. And you can choose in a game like Elden Ring which enemies you want to face in which order, whether you want to stealth through that horribly dangerous camp to then get stomped on by the giant on the other side, or you want to see if you can fight all of the guys in the camp and then get stomped on by the giant on the other side. I think the point is made and my time is getting a little short. So what I'm going to say is that where I took that was to talk about BioWare Games, and then the chapter that got shown at the beginning, talked about at the beginning, the Bethesda chapter. I had BioWare talking about the BioWare style, Bethesda talking about the Bethesda style, and I'm interested now in figuring out whether we can do something with the FromSoftware style, which is Elden Ring, and then to, I think, a great extent, because they share an essential mechanic that a lot of people find very attractive. I think of it as impossibility. But in any case, the central elements of style revolve around what I think of these days as an immersion mechanic or an identity mechanic. That is, to put it really briefly, who are you in this game? It is to some extent what is this game about, but it's what is this game about in a really specific way. And the immersion mechanic in Homeric epic, and I think of the Iliad and the Odyssey as slightly different platforms, but in either case, the key immersion mechanic is, the Greek word is kleos. It means glory, but it's a kind of glory that is based on what people say about you, and above all, on what people hear about you. So who are you? You are what people remember about you and what people say about you, especially if they say it in formulaic epic. So it is, as you'll find a lot of great games being about themselves, epic is fundamentally about itself, and you don't even need the presence of a bard named Demodocus to tell you that. Okay, so BioWare. BioWare, above all, features these sliders, as I think of them. In Knights of the Old Republic, it's a slider between light and dark. And as you do stuff in the game, your slider moves, and you either embrace the light side of the Force, or you embrace the dark side of the Force, or you try to stay neutral. And the central facet of being who you are is making, and I think this is probably going to be a little contentious, making fake ethical choices about what you're going to do in the game, because in the end, I think the first one is maybe the most memorable one for players of KOTOR. You can either help a poor schlub who's getting beaten on by some criminals, or you can stand by, or you can help the criminals. But you haven't actually hurt anyone. You have kind of experimented with how it feels in a game to do that stuff. But if you do the bad thing, you embrace the dark a little bit. If you do the right thing, you embrace the light. Now, on the other hand, Bethesda is fundamentally the immersion mechanic, as I think of it, is community affiliation. You join stuff in Bethesda games, and who you are in the end is the question of who you join. One of the people think is kind of a weakness of Skyrim is that the joining isn't all that significant in Skyrim, as it is in kind of earlier Elder Scrolls games. And that points out something about BioWare games is too, even if you make those fake ethical choices, you still end up as the savior. In Skyrim, you also end up as the savior, but you end up as the savior whether or not you do the joining. And I guess the final thing is, okay, what are we going to do with Elden Ring? And I've put in probably 20 hours of gameplay in Elden Ring, which is nothing, especially for somebody as bad at games as I am. And I've also watched probably 5 hours of YouTube stuff in various directions. And so you are, in Elden Ring, you are tarnished. And that seems to me completely in keeping with FromSoftware's style, which is, as I said, impossibility. The lore, which I watched 10 minutes of a YouTube video about and then realized was probably impenetrable as a feature rather than as a bug. The lore is impossible to figure out, but it gives you the feeling that the world is irreparably broken. And even if you manage to slay all of the things you can slay, just the fact that there are all of these monuments around you to the deaths that you had, the deaths that others had, shows that being tarnished is fundamentally a position of kind of gaining virtuosity at slaying against the backdrop of the impossibility of that virtuosity making a real difference in the end, which is a very contemporary way to think of yourself, I think. And with that, I'll just see whether anyone wants to offer me a lifeline on Elden Ring or on anything else. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Ross, or Roger. Sorry, that was very interesting. I mean, we've had some comments here. I know I've written down quite a bit in terms of both of your presentations and Ross's ideas. How we view these historical spaces, and really makes me think about these representational modes. And I think you had even quoted Spivak once saying, that you have these verbal slippages happening, this idea of Greekness of what an object represents, and Roger, these ideas of immersion and what these mean. So to begin, so I don't have to start the questions, we're going to open it up to the audience. I see that Dr. Kellerer has a question, if she would like to unmute and ask. And if you have a question, just raise your hand, or you can put it in the chat, and then Sean will moderate that.
Will.
Thank you all. Thank you so much, Dr. Clare, Dr. Travis, for your presentations, and to everybody for organizing this. You've given this non-gamer some real things to think about. And I wanted to kind of, probe into something that Dr. Clare said, and that I think something Dr. Travis said helped me illuminate. And that's this idea of, video games, we shouldn't be, video games don't, aren't, they have a different kind of thinking than historical thinking. And to be clear, I don't think video games any more than fiction need to be history in order to have value. They can have value on their own as sort of an art form and an entertainment form. But I wonder if maybe there is some overlap there, and that might cause us as historians to think about how gaming, sort of what you talked about, like the cognitive processes in gaming, might help us. We might turn that back on the way we think about history. I was thinking in terms of this idea of games as sort of this world building exercise that is like layers of references that draw from everywhere, like all these different places. There's the insertion of the personal. I think we can, as historians, think more about how we can think about what we do as historians like that. But I was especially interested when Dr. Travis brought up this idea of multiform narrative. That kind of made something click about your presentation. The idea that just like gameplay changes every single time, and the individual is always bringing something into it, that historians go back to the same wells again and again. You know, we will talk about the Peloponnesian Wars or something over and over again, but that changes depending on like what the player is bringing into it there. And that we are all in the process of kind of doing a little bit of world building on our own, and that you know, that we can learn lessons from that and say, okay, yeah, absolutely, we're kind of doing, I see it as not doing vastly different things, but doing very similar things in some ways. And I'm wondering what either of you might think about as sort of some of these parallels that we could use in history. And I will mute myself and take my answer off the air, so to speak.
Go ahead, Ross. I mean, all right. I mean, I said the games in history would be completely diametrically opposed necessarily, but I do like to think of the processes that go into kind of reaching a historical conclusion, let's say, in the processes of playing a historical game always seem necessarily at least a little bit different to me, and I think they end up in different places as well. So I think that if you're trying to do some kind of academic history of some kind, and you're trying to, well, I suppose you're drawing on what's effectively a roughly accepted kind of continuum of facts, I suppose, or at least things that we believe to be true. And that's right, it's a consensus, it's a kind of continuum of generally believed things. Whereas in this other world, is this stuff of pure imagination, I suppose, things that just sort of exist as echoes of things you don't even actually have to know them, and they don't have to be in any way true or backed up by anything. This idea that you can mesh Greece and Rome together, you can mesh kind of Greek history and Greek mythology, as so many people do. It's Rome is a place of people, and Greece is a place where people are riding on horses with wings. You know what I mean? That's kind of what you can do out there. You can do that right there, and that's what you. To me, it's what you have to do. That's the level that you have to be on, sort of psychologically, to enter into this kind of popular continuum of history or of the ancient world. Whereas I guess the other thing, it just seems, I realize I'm talking about feelings and stuff, but it seems different, it feels different. It's if you were to expand the definition of what doing history is, then it would eventually, I think, overlap. And I think that's probably worth doing, but I think that needs doing first. Otherwise, there's a kind of risk, really, of just sort of bringing historical games in and just assuming that they're doing the same thing as something else.
And I think that's what I'm getting at, is that what you're saying about gaming and the processes involved in it can and maybe should cause us to expand what we think doing history is and can be. I'm not advocating for, like, you know, bringing in the Pegasus into your next ancient history paper, but, you know, although that would be interesting, but I think that there's a lot that historians can think about there as well.
Yeah, that's kind of the inspiration behind the way that I connected my presentation, which is that this was the way that the ancients thought about their past. And even in Rome, when Virgil is writing the Aeneid, and history is much farther advanced than it was for the Homeric bards, the Aeneid was still taken. Well, to put it from a slightly different perspective, Livy, who is known as one of the great Roman historians, tells versions of Aeneas' story that are just as outlandish as the one that Virgil has. And it's hard to say exactly how, well, I'm not an ancient historian, so it is what I guess what I'm getting hung up on is, it was Virgil thought of as being history. And at that point, no, because they're different genres. Epic and history are different genres. But the way that the Romans think about the past is definitely not the kind of more or less scientific way that we think about it, at least when we're calling it history within an academic context. But at the same time, I think it's really valuable to include, even if you call it historiography rather than history, to include creative ways of recomposing the past in our conception of what history is and what historians should study.
Thank you both very much. Again, I enjoyed both of these talks a lot. They've given me a lot to think about.
Thanks.
Thank you as well, Dr. Kelleher. We have questions from students. I think Ashley Liu was next in line. Her question's in chat, but I think she also is going to ask it directly. So go ahead, Ashley.
Hi, thank you, first of all, for showing us such a great presentation and more information about what you do. My question was, what advice do you have for people wanting to get into the gaming industry, whether it's academic involved or with other specialties? Because I do really want to step my foot into that industry.
I would honestly have a plan B that you're going to need to kind of possibly rest on for a while, because I managed to, I picked up academia, I just sort of fell into academia really, and then it you have the adjunct system there, is that right? So this kind of the system effectively having people on for very little money and very little time. We have that here too, and I couldn't make a living off it, so I thought, what else would I like to do? I will go to the game industry. I have a PhD, they'll all be falling over themselves to pick me up. That didn't happen at all. A PhD will only get you very far. So you either begin now, I guess, trying to experiment with, it depends on what you want to do, I guess, in games, what necessarily want to do. I'm a game writer now, so I experimented with free interactive tools and things and basically built a portfolio and tried to make sure everyone could see it. And because it's very much, you need experience to get a job effectively. So while you're doing that, you might need to be doing something else for work. So I guess, I don't know, however many years you have left on study, I try and set some time aside as you're doing that to work at forging connections and building a portfolio, because it's tough to get into, very much so, unless you were doing something like user experience, that kind of thing, user experience research, which is a little easier to prove. No one wants to hire a writer. No one thinks it means anything, which sometimes it doesn't. So yeah, sorry, apologies for rambling. You want to get something together that kind of proves you can do what they want you to do, and probably get on LinkedIn and connect with as many people as possible, and make sure everyone can see you. It's very much a kind of who you know kind of thing, which is very sad. But you know me now, so.
Thank you, Ross.
All right. David Herrero was next on our list.
Hi, can you guys hear me? Is everything good? Okay. So I guess my question, just to pull it up again. It's more towards like what Professor Travis talked about a little bit, but I guess also Professor Clare can also talk about it. But I was like, I found the oral retelling from like bards during like this ancient times, like in terms of like these stories, like, you know, the Aeneid and stuff like that. I'm like extremely interesting in a sense. I think you're touching about how like these bards almost kind of seem to immerse themselves within these stories, as, you know, they potentially reach different story endings or story points within the same story. But so would you say like in a way these bards are like players, like kind of like in these stories as they immerse themselves within them and they're kind of playing the story? And like would this form of like oral history in the past be kind of similar to the immersion that players today get when they're playing a game and interacting with like a fictional world or a historically fiction world that is created by, you know, said game developer or said game creator?
Yeah, that's actually precisely the analogy that I always gravitate towards, that the bard is the player, and then the bard's audience are, well, generally I say that they're the people watching Let's Play videos on YouTube. But I came up with that analogy before Twitch got really big. So now that people are playing while they're live streaming and people are telling them what to do in the games, that's probably the best analogy there could possibly be for the bard's audience. And there's a moment that I didn't have time to go into, that I'll just go into briefly, which comes right when Odysseus sets up his relationship with Demodocus, says, "You're really great." And then he says, okay, so I will call you the greatest bard there ever was if you tell me this particular story. And if you sing me this particular song. And then the song he asks Demodocus to sing is the story of the Trojan horse, which is basically the uber famous. If you remember one thing about Troy, what you remember is the Trojan horse. First of all, it's pretty clear that this moment turns on Demodocus living on an island that's way, way away from everybody else. And at least the possibility that he does not know that story, that what Odysseus is asking him to do is to sing a song he doesn't know, like a completely new song. I personally think, and you have to do a bit of mental gymnastics, but once you realize the way that the epics came together, it's not a big deal at all. I think that this is the origin of the Trojan horse story, that the first bard who came up with the Trojan horse came up with it in the context of Odysseus asking Demodocus to sing about this Trojan horse. And then it starts there. And then the next time we hear about the Trojan horse is when book 4 of the Odyssey gets put together. Now, I could lead all of those who are interested all the way through my reasoning on this, and you might end up saying, nah. But in any case, what Odysseus asked Demodocus to do, whether or not we buy that theory, is an incredible act of virtuosity. And so he's saying, okay, basically, can you play the Dark Souls version of this stuff you've been doing? You've been singing all these things about the heroes, and I recognize them, but I need a special story. And the reason he needs it is that he needs King Alcinous to notice that he's been weeping. So he chooses the story that's going to make him weep the hardest. And then the kicker is that at the beginning of book 9, after Alcinous stops Demodocus and says, no, we love this, but we need to hear what this guy is all about, who hasn't revealed who he is. And it's that moment that Odysseus says, first of all, Demodocus is great and immersion is great, but now you want to hear about me. Oh, woe is me. I'm Odysseus, the most famous liar in the entire world. And now here are all of these stories, which are clearly lies. And this is the thing that I don't think most students get about the Odyssey, which is that we have to take everything Odysseus says with an enormous grain of salt. And that just makes it better.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.
My pleasure.
There was mythologists is how they're listed in the chat, had asked a question that was being chatted around in the chat. Would you like to bring that out into the larger conversation, mythologists? Or I can ask it for them. So they asked, what would you all say to the idea that in the game of the Odyssey, Phemius and Demodocus are the avatars of Homer?
So as I said in the chat, I don't believe in Homer as a person, but if we say the Homer, or really more properly the Homerid, which is where I think the name Homer comes from, absolutely. That the bard. If you think of the bard as the player, now we're thinking of a game. It reminds me of, I'm going to blank on what the game is. It's a VR game where you play a kid playing Duck Hunt. But if the bard is the player, then they are playing within that story as Demodocus or Phemius, as they're playing it in front of the audience. So yeah.
I'm seeing vigorous shaking of head from Dr. Clare. So
I leave it there. I can't follow that.
that's fair. And Mythologist had responded, that's what I meant. Colin, I believe, was next, if they want to ask their question as well.
Hello. So yeah, so my knowledge of history and mythology is very shallow. I'm much more of a gamer, I'd say. I'm actually studying engineering right now, and this talk was forwarded to me by my Greek mythology professor. But I fell in love with the game Hades, and I think that it does a really good job of kind of personifying the Olympian gods. And I think that's kind of dangerous territory from what I've learned in my Greek literature class or Greek mythology class. But I've heard from various sources that it's quite accurate, and I kind of wanted to see if that could be corroborated or expanded upon, or, you know, any general ideas on the game and the personalities of the gods they're in.
Ross, have you played Hades?
Not yet, no, because I'm told it's a Metroidvania kind of thing, and I find that kind of thing really frustrating.
Yeah, well, I mean, I did too. I bounced off Bastion and had to watch my son play it. But Hades does a really great job of ramping difficulty. I haven't finished it, but because of my interest in it, I explored it via Let's Play, etc. But I had a much more enjoyable time playing it than I've ever had playing that kind of game before. And especially to the question, I had much more enjoyable time from the perspective of finding the Greek myth world that I know being embodied in that game. As I said in the chat, it comes from a source called the Orphica, which is this fascinatingly ambiguous set of mythological texts that tell us strange things that we don't know from elsewhere. And above all, seem, I guess from my perspective as a guy who loves multi-form stories, seem to give some radically different forms to the way that the Olympian gods were related to one another. In the context, it's pretty clear of these mysteries that were related somehow to the mysteries at Eleusis, but were separate from them, and had to do with the poet divinity Orpheus, usually called the son of Apollo, although in Sandman he's the son of Morpheus. I give it the highest grade for any mythology-based game I've ever played.
Good to hear. Thank you.
Sorry, Colin.
No, go ahead.
No, I do hear that a lot, but no, I don't mean to sound antagonistic to anybody, but I would wonder what accurate really means, what getting it right really means, and why that matters, or does that matter to you? Does it? For a start, is it accurate if you represent in a game an obvious lie someone said about a Roman emperor, or are you looking for the reality of the situation? Are you looking for a reproduction of a text, or with Hades, for example, are you looking for it to be accurate to this myth, or that myth, or the other myth, the kind of many different tellings of the same story? I hear it is very accurate to the text of the Orphica, that it's kind of taken away from, and lots of other stuff too. But I'll in the book I wrote, there's a case study of a strategy game that has a massive guide that tells you all about the history of Rome in detail, about this building and that building, all the things you can do in the game, and what the historical component is. And it kind of just makes me think that I think it's the starkest contrast between what you would kind of do and imagine and conceive and act out in a game versus an apparent reality, I suppose. This is why I always think it's most important for a game to feel right rather than be right.
Can I
Not any
propose
enemies.
can I propose an alternative term to accuracy, which would be thematicness, or maybe just theme? As I work on the card games that I'm working on, and there are 3 of them, and they each come from an existing story world, Marvel, Lord of the Rings, and Arkham Horror. And one of the things that I'm kind of spending most of my time on trying to describe is what makes a mechanic feel thematic. It definitely, sometimes it does overlap with accuracy. That is, something feels thematic in a Marvel game because I read a comic that felt like that, and they didn't get anything wrong about that mechanic. But it's the question then becomes, and I think your example of that strategy guide is a really great way of asking the question. What do we do with that, and what does it mean for doing history by whatever definition we're talking about history?
I think it's probably the biggest question at the minute is thematicness. That's great. I like it. It's better than feelings. I don't want to keep saying feeling to a room full of people. That's good. I like that, because we use authenticity as opposed to accuracy, because there's no such thing as historical accuracy, really, when you think about it. And in a sense, everything that we do in history is imagined anyway. It's just imagined, but ultimately that's that kind of, what it is, what it exists in the text or the artifact, to me has to be agreed upon, whereas everything else is like the Wild West. You know what I mean? Or the kind of continuum of,
I think we're getting towards the end. I get asked, just on that note, I mean, these are discussions we have a lot with our students: accuracy, authenticity, and the thematic idea. And I think this again goes, I like both your ideas with this idea of Greekness, and from another a quote here from it deals, actually made me think of it because you mentioned the Wild West, and it's from a book about the West called Print the Legend, which is about photographs, but the way photographs tell stories. And the quote is, "Do pictures themselves tell stories, or do viewers tell stories about them?" And that made me think of this and what you're both talking about, and particularly you, Ross, with the idea of that Greekness. Did you want to speak to that at all, as kind of or both of you, as a final claim, and how, those images are they're both a creation as a sort of maybe a player expectation, but players also then read into those an idea of whatever term you want to use here: accuracy, authenticity, thematicness.
maybe it's Schrodinger's game until it's played, doesn't it? Well, nothing exists at all until you engage with it, because I like to think that that the player brings their expectations, preconceptions, their own kind of semi-knowledges of stuff, and that kind of perhaps interacts, like when you put a mint in a Coca-Cola bottle, with what is already in the game, and they kind of create something else. You know what I mean? Create something new that kind of just spills out there and exists in some abstract sense, which is authentic to the idea of Greece, or the idea of Rome, or the idea of history, as opposed to authentic to what we agree is history. Yeah, I'm done.
I think that feeling of authenticity and of theme is created above all by immersion. I think it can probably exist without it, but I think it's part of immersion. And I've come to think of immersion as a kind of identification between the player, not and necessarily the characters, although the characters involved, but with the rule set of the game. That is, this game is about me, and it's my performance. And I mean, it's kind of a commonplace of modern theory, but it's always the story of you that you're reading in one way or another.
Well, we will, I think we have hit just almost on the minute our time at this point. And I'd like to thank both of our presenters today. All
right. Yeah, I think we will end it there. Then we'll cut off. And Yeah, thanks everybody for showing up and asking questions. We look forward to having another talk next semester.